Hello, this is the recording for Lesson 2.07, Evidence for Evolution 1. So here's a description of what we'll be learning today. We learned about the theory of natural selection and how it occurs, but what we're going to look at in the next couple lessons is the scientific evidence or proof that support natural selection. One thing that we're going to focus on is how we use similar physical characteristics as a means of evidence for evolution. We say that if two animals have similar physical characteristics, then that means that they possibly could have evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, so the three main lines of evidence support this aspect of the theory of evolution. Here are the three. The first one is anatomical similarities. So this would be similarities in their structure or anatomy. Embryonic development, which would be similarities in the embryos, which are basically how they develop in the womb. And then we have vestigial structures, which are basically structures that are no longer useful in an organism but could point to the fact that the structure was useful to the organism's ancestors a long time ago. So we're going to be looking at all three of those. And here's an example in this picture. We have a modern day elephant, right? One that you would probably see, you've probably seen in like a zoo or something. And then an Ice Age mammoth that was around a long time ago. And we see that there are clear similarities. So we would say that they possibly have a common ancestor. So using comparative anatomy, again, we're looking at the similarities in physical structure. Okay, so if you were to look at this elephant as well as this chicken, you probably would say that they don't have a common ancestor, because if you look at their skin, right, elephants have wrinkly gray skin, whereas chickens have feathers and wings. Obviously very different. The elephant also has that really useful long and strong trunk, but the chicken doesn't have anything of that sort. However, biologists don't really just look at what they can see on the outside. They look at it a little bit more closely. If they do see similarities in structure, right, then they can suggest that there are some sort of shared ancestry or that there's a common ancestor. Okay, so instead of just looking on the outside, they can observe the skeletal structure and the similarities between an elephant and a chicken. And if they were to look at all the vertebrate animals, right, all animals with a backbone, so that would be like birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, very different organisms. But if they were to look at the skeletal structure, they could see that there is possibly a common ancestor that all of them came from millions of years ago. In most vertebrates that are alive today, the bones of one species nearly always have corresponding bones in another species. So corresponding meaning that they have they're similar in structure. They might not be exactly the same, but we can compare it in some way. The skeletons of a chicken and elephant, for example, have many bones in common. Evidence from fossils indicate that the ancestors of vertebrates have many of the same structures of animals that live today. And we're going to be looking at that in this lesson. We call similar structures that maybe have been modified homologous structures. And so if we look at this picture right here, we see homologous structures with these bones that are all right here. Okay, so if you were to look at the front leg of an alligator and the arm of a human, you probably wouldn't know that they are homologous structures. But if we look a little bit more closely at the skeletal structure of those two animals, we can see that there are actually a lot of similarities. For example, here's the alligator, and here's the human arm. We see that they both have a long bone, right, called the humerus. Attached to the long bone are two smaller bones, right, which are called the ulna and the radius, and you see that in both of them. And then they progress, having some sort of wrist, right, which are called carpals, and then some finger-like bones, which would be the metacarpals and the phalanges. Okay? And not just the alligator and the human, but we see the same thing in the wing of a penguin and the wing of a bat. And so we see these again are corresponding skeletal structures, maybe not exactly the same, but we do see clear similarities. And we call these structures homologous structures. The homologous structures that we see in these organisms basically imply or suggest that the underlying structure arose in a common ancestor. The reason why all these organisms have like a humerus, an ulna, the radius, etc., is because the common ancestor had all of these, and then from there they made modifications. And those modifications are based on the populations adapting to different environments. Remember, the environmental changes really determine on which adaptations actually are beneficial. So for example, let's say all the vertebrate groups all had that same similar bone structures. However, some may live in water, others may make that transition from water into land. So that means that their limbs no longer will look exactly the same but need to be suited for walking. Or you can have organisms that need to do things such as fly, right? Which means that clearly their forelimbs need to be modified not for walking but for flying. So what you see here is that continued modification of bones resulted in somewhat different shapes as populations of different species were adapted to different environments. However, you see the same exact order in all of those organisms. Okay, and you could even see that in one particular organism. For example, in a horse, we could see the differences that can occur based on natural selection. So this is the horse that we know today, and some advantages that a horse has is that it runs fast, right? And so you see that its leg and body is changing over millions of years to accommodate for this great adaptation of running fast. We see that at first it has prominent toes, right? But it starts losing it, and it becomes, the bones become more solidified and stronger, right? It becomes more of like one piece and stronger, and you no longer see any toes, and because you see more of like a hoof. And so this is an adaptation that allows the horse to run fast. And so again, this would be an ancestor of the horse, and then the progression to what we see today as a modern horse. And this is due to the environment. So another type of evidence of evolution would be the comparative embryology. And so we can look at the vertebrate embryos, or how they develop as an embryo, and it could suggest that we have a similar common ancestor. And the reason why is because development occurs because of DNA instructions, right? Our instructions in our DNA tell us how to develop even from when we are an embryo. And so if the DNA is similar, so if DNA is similar then that could suggest that we have a common ancestor. Okay, so that's the rationale behind comparative embryology. And so we see right here, that all of these embryos look very similar, right? The starting point is very similar. And even when we look at this second row right here, they still look pretty similar, right? And that means that the development from the beginning to the second stage must be pretty similar, which means that the DNA instructions must have some sort of similarity as well. These are embryos of very different organisms like a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human being. In the end, they look very different, but the beginning stages, they do look very similar, which suggests that they have similar DNA instructions pointing to a common ancestor. Okay, and the last evidence for evolution that we're going to look at in this lesson is called vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are an evidence for evolution because of the idea of descent with modification, meaning that as organisms develop and evolve and modify, there could be traces of evidences of a common ancestor by this vestigial structure, which basically is a structure that no longer is useful in an organism. So nearly every feature of an organism really is an adaptation that helps it survive. We don't really have things that don't help us because we're very efficient organisms, right? If something doesn't help us, we probably have either lost it or it isn't really apparent. However, there are a few structures that really don't have any function at all, and these structures are actually quite interesting because if it serves us no function, then it might cause you to think, why exactly do we have this structure in the first place? Okay, so that means that vestigial structures, right, were once necessary adaptations in our ancestors, but they are in modern day organisms. Okay, because the environment changed, they're no longer useful. At one point they were, but not anymore. For example, if we look at this ostrich right here, this ostrich has wings, but it doesn't fly. Their ancestors, however, probably did fly, and so that's how they have their wings. The ostrich and the emu descended from flying ancestors, even though they themselves do not fly. Another example in humans would be an appendix, something that can be removed, right, because it doesn't serve any important function in our bodies. But maybe our ancestors had use for it for further digestion. So to summarize what we went over in this lesson, remember that we looked at scientific evidence that supports the theory of evolution. And the three different evidence of evolution that we looked at was comparative embryology, where we looked at the similarities and differences between the development of embryos, right? Remember, if there are any similarities, that suggests that there are DNA similarities, because if they're developing similar, that means that they must have the same instructions that originate from their DNA. We have comparative homology, where we looked at the homologous structures. Remember, this was like the forelimbs of all those organisms, like the bat, the penguin, the alligator, and the human all had similar bones. And then we had the vestigial structures, which were those useless structures for modern day organisms that were possibly useful to a previous ancestor, but since the environment change is no longer useful for the modern day organism. Okay, so here are some vocabulary words that are important. 1. Comparative anatomy, the study of similarities and differences in the anatomy of different organisms. 2. Homologous structures, structures that occur in different species but are similar enough to suggest that the species had a common ancestor. 3. Comparative embryology, the study of similarities and differences in the embryos of different organisms. And then vestigial structures, structures that appear to have no function or are useless for the organism but probably had some sort of function in an ancestral organism.